I would like to welcome everybody participating in this meeting, which has been called by the Socialist Equality Party. And it's been called to discuss the lessons of the Coles Smeaton Grange struggle, its implications, its consequences, not only for workers in warehouses, but for the working class as a whole. And as I said, my name is Cheryl Crisp and I'll be chairing today. You may be actually wondering why the outcome of a dispute involving 350 workers in the far southwestern suburbs of Sydney could affect the future direction of workers in other warehouses, industries, cities and towns. The fact that these workers faced a literal conspiracy between Coles, the union, the UWU, the media and the government highlights the importance that those institutions placed on defeating this struggle. The media issued a virtual D-notice ensuring the 14-week lockout, one of the longest in Australia for many years, was not so much as mentioned on mainstream outlets. And behind this veil of silence, Coles and the union worked hand in glove to wear down the workers through isolation, threats, starvation, and almost a dozen votes with the same offer. Everything possible was thrown at this group of workers to ensure they did not defeat Coles's agenda because so much depended on it. If the Smeaton Grange workers were able to push back the closure, the sackings, the casualisation of the workforce, the gutting of conditions, then this could become a springboard for so many other sections of workers throughout all industries who face the same conditions to do the same thing. Our speakers today will explain the connection, in fact, the commonality of the experiences at the hands of employers, the government and the unions of broad sections of the working class, and that which the Smeaton Grange workers passed through. It is important to understand certainly what happened, how it happened, who is responsible, because workers do have to know who their friends are and who their enemies are. But most importantly, the working class and ourselves have to learn from it. That means what was the perspective which resulted in the betrayal and the defeat of these workers, and therefore what perspective is necessary to ensure this experience is not repeated. That is the purpose of the meeting. Before we go into that, however, I think it's important to remind ourselves that 5 weeks ago, on February the 6th, we met to discuss what at that point was a turning point in the fight against Coles's imposition of mass sackings and the destruction of working conditions. In opening that meeting, I said that we had to place the dispute in its global context, which was the COVID-19 pandemic surging throughout the world. At that stage, 106 million people had been infected with the virus and 2.3 died. 36 days later, there is now 120 million infected and almost 2.7 people dead. It means that every day, 390,000 people are being infected and almost 10,000 die of it. Along with the appalling death toll and suffering of millions of people, there is mass unemployment, accelerating inequality, increased poverty and homelessness and deprivation. But on the other side, along with this, Wall Street soars and the wealth of the tiny elite skyrocket. In the course of 2020, which was throughout the pandemic, Elon Musk, the wealthiest man in the world, earned more than 2.7 billion a week. This amount, as it turns out, the amount of 2.7 billion, is what it cost to organise, build, launch and land NASA's space rover Perseverance on Mars. We correctly said, in response to the February 18 milestone, that this was a scientific and technological achievement of the highest order, involving meticulous planning of thousands of people across 3 different continents and 8 years in the building. But while this feat of mankind was being undertaken, 11 million Americans, 4.5 million households in Texas were without what is in the 21st century the basic necessities of life: power. This was provoked initially by a snowstorm, but in fact the real reason that you had so many people without electricity is because the power companies in Texas had separated themselves from the national grid to avoid oversight, avoid costs, and so did not have enough power when this freak storm hit. The power companies were able to do this because electricity and gas supplies are in the hands of private ownership, as they are here. So more than 80 people died in Texas, not because it was cold, but because in the richest country in the world, it couldn't guarantee power, gas, or water supplies to its population. This was no more a natural disaster than the pandemic is a medical crisis. The conditions and the resources exist today to be able to not just predict pandemics and viruses, but to deal with them. But that would require the wealth of society to be allocated for the benefit of that society. What the pandemic has done is expose that capitalism is not just incapable, but unwilling to meet the needs of society. While under a rational, planned society, that is a socialist society, such developments like the vaccine, used and developed to protect the world's population from the virus, would be organised through international collaboration, planning, and consciousness. What has emerged under capitalism in the 21st century, in 2020 and 2021, is chaos. Along with that, trade war measures adopted to increase tensions between countries. Notwithstanding the development of the vaccine, its distribution in many countries, including Australia, has become a debacle. And there is now what is being described as a 3rd wave of infections and deaths afflicting many countries. But irrespective of the rollout of the vaccine or the infection rates, every government, again, including Australia, is declaring there will be no more border closures, no more lockdowns or restrictions, schools must reopen, and everything returns to what is euphemistically called normalcy. And it's clear that the only reason the states in Australia undertook limited border closures and lockdowns is because they are fully aware that a renewed outbreak of the virus would result in an upsurge of struggles in the working class. One thing the West Australian election does highlight is that WA Labor Premier Mark McGowan was not re-elected yesterday, wiping out the Liberals from 15 seats to 3, because he represents the interests of large sections of mining and iron ore capitalism. That is something which is clear, and he carries out policies in the interests of these multinational corporations. The reason that he won the support that he did is because he is associated with the actions regarding COVID-19, themselves carried out because of the fear of the response amongst the population. The same result took place in the Queensland elections. But we have to be clear, these governments have acted, as did Morrison, out of a fear of the uprising of the working class. But restrictions now, it is declared, are a thing of the past. The International Committee has characterised the pandemic as a trigger event, which is only comparable to the outbreak of World War I, and has produced a crisis on par with that of the 1930s depression and World War II. The response of the capitalist class in 1914 and in the 1930s was fascism and war. And it is the very clear direction which capitalism is taking today. Fascist hordes rampaging through the Capitol building in Washington, incited and supported by the then President of the United States, is not a product of the individual Trump or of even the United States itself, but is the sharpest expression of the turn of the ruling class to the most murderous and violent forms of rule. And the Biden administration will be not fundamentally different. The United States military has just requested of Congress that it double the military's budget in the Pacific as a massive and provocative build-up against China. The head of the Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Davidson, stated this week that it was not just a military build-up or muscle flexing that was being requested, but, and I'll quote, "We absolutely must be prepared to fight and win should competition turn to conflict," which he has predicted is an event and an eventuality which is years away, not decades. Discussions are being had in the Biden administration about the deployment of missiles in Japan and possibly Taiwan aimed at China, something that would be seen inevitably as an act of war by China. And the Australian government and its ruling class is centrally involved in this perspective, placing the Australian population on the front line in the event of war. History has proven that war abroad means war against the working class at home, and that has already commenced in every country. The trillions of dollars handed to major corporations, multinational businesses, and the wealthy elite in the course of the pandemic now have to be paid back. And that is going to be extracted through the accelerated exploitation of the working class throughout the world. We are living through unprecedented times, but history has parallels and experiences from which we must learn. World War I was ended not through the diplomacy of capitalist politicians, but through the intervention of the working class, in particular through the Russian Revolution. That revolution, notwithstanding its later degeneration, proved that the proletarian revolutionary struggles can be victorious if led by a far-sighted, clear and socialist leadership, as it was with the Bolshevik Party. And the reverse is also the case. When that leadership does not exist, as what took place in 1918 in Germany, 1923, and other countries, no matter how courageous and determined those struggles are, they will be defeated. We are living through a revolutionary period. Those lessons must be studied, learned, and taken up by workers throughout the world. To open our contributions today, I'm very pleased to introduce John Hughes. John is an Australia Post worker. He is a member of the Postal Workers Rank and File Committee and was one of the number of Australia Post staff who gave interviews of support to the Smeaton Grange workers. These statements, as all the comments by teachers, academic staff and students, were not elicited by their unions or the UWU, but by the World Socialist website. And that is how most of the workers outside of Smeaton Grange learned about the Coles lockout. To discuss the lessons and the commonality of the experiences between Australia Post workers and those of the Coles warehouse workers, please welcome John Hughes.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be speaking on behalf of the Postal Workers Rank and File Committee today, because we think the experience of Smeaton Grange has been a crucial one for the working class as a whole. Broad sections of the working class, including in warehousing, logistics at Australia Post, and far more broadly, are being pushed into struggle. We are facing not only the criminal negligent response to the pandemic of the ruling class, but also the attempt to use this crisis to distribute even more wealth from the working class to the financial elite through sweeping restructuring, job destruction, and an assault on our working conditions. There are clear parallels between the situation facing Coles workers and what we are up against at Australia Post. Both companies are carrying out a sweeping overhaul that has already driven up revenue and profits at the direct expense of workers. In February, Australia Post announced a 15.5% year-on-year jump in revenue to $4.3 billion for the first half of 2021 financial year. This was mostly on the back of a 25.9% increase in parcel revenue to $3.4 billion. Parcel deliveries produced a $240.8 million profit, yielding an overall after-tax return of $166.6 million for the 6-month period. This is directly on the back of the biggest restructuring in Australia Post history, which has already resulted in massive increase in our workload and delivery demands. As part of this overhaul, AP announced that there would be a reduction of almost 2,000 workers, some of which has already been achieved by workers leaving because they are unable to deal with the increased demands of deliveries. Just before the sellout of by the union at the Smeaton Grange Coles announced that it had raked in due to the pandemic and the brutal increase in exploitation of workers, $500 million in the last half of the financial year. The dispute at Smeaton Grange was betrayed by the United Workers Union, which isolated these workers by refusing to organise support from other sites. The union continuously told workers the only option they had was to accept the company's offer and refuse to pay workers strike pay, which they used to starve them into submission. This sellout has once again shown that the unions have been transformed into a police force of management. They are no longer workers' organisations. This was most clearly exposed by Chief Operations Officer Mark Swindle in a video posted online in February. He denounced the Smeaton Grange workers for resisting a union sellout. He openly defended the UWU against socialist criticism of the SCP. Swindle warned that extremist anti-union socialists, by which he meant the SCP, had a plan for a broader struggle against big business and the banks. But what is Swindle's plan? Speaking on behalf of the entire ruling class, he made clear the demands of big business and financial capital. They seek nothing less than the complete restructuring of these major industries to remain competitive in the ruthless global struggle for markets and profit share. To do this, they are demanding workers accept wage cuts, speed ups, and destruction of jobs to achieve massive increase in productivity and profits. This is not just happening in Coles. During the pandemic, Australia Post established pop-up sites and hired thousands of casuals to meet increased demands due to online shopping. These casuals were also used during the peak periods like Christmas. Many have now been laid off. What we are seeing is a massive growth of casualised workforce, directly enforced by the unions. In April last year, the Morris government gave Australia Post regulatory relief, allowing it to reduce everyday letter delivery and to start a massive restructuring called the Alternative Delivery Model, or ADM. Workers at Australia Post took the decision to form the Postal Workers Rank and File Committee due to the collaboration of the unions with management in the implementation of the ADM. Riding roughshod over the democratic rights over its own members, the unions never informed us that they were going to sign the Memorandum of Understanding with the CEO, Christine Holgate, that agreed to the introduction of the ADM. This agreement also contained a 12-month no-strike clause, tying the hands of workers and committing the unions to implement the ADM. In depots where workers had openly opposed the union collaboration, the bureaucrats have stamped down on the opposition. The union told workers that there is nothing we can do because of all the anti-strike industrial relations laws. For its part, the ACTU, the main body, said nothing about the change at Australia Post. It refused to mobilise any opposition to the attacks or on the Coles workers. In fact, the ACTU has proven to be an important ally of the Morrison government and the employers. When the pandemic broke out, Sally McManus, the head of the ACTU, entered into closed-door discussions with the Industrial Relations Minister, Christian Porter, to hammer out the best way to reduce the burden of the economic crisis caused by the pandemic on the employers. The ACTU has held secret discussions with the employers and the government to develop this agenda. It has agreed to changes in awards that have seen the lowering of wages and overtime conditions and are more in line with the gig economy. Thus, Smeaton Grange dispute is a very sharp example of this process. It shows that the unions and all their defenders are the mechanism through which the defeats are imposed on workers. Workers are going through very painful experiences, and they are starting to recognise that it's no longer possible to conduct a struggle against the ruling class within the framework of these old organisations. It is necessary for the workers everywhere to follow the example of the postal workers and establish and build their own rank and file committees. These committees must be independent of management and the unions. They have to fight for the unity of the working class in every area and industry, including those who have been forced into the gig economy. These committees will bring together all workers who want to resist the combined management union offensive. They will provide a forum for the democratic discussion of a way forward for workers, the concrete actions that must be taken, and the political issues we are confronted with. The political perspective the SEP fights for in the rank and file committees is one based on socialist internationalism. The unions defend capitalism and the interests of their own national industry. Over the past decades, they have taken this position to its logical conclusion and now function as open agents of big business. We think the alternative is to fight for the unity of the working class internationally and to reorganize society to meet the interests of the majority, not the profit interests of a tiny financial elite. This is the fight for a workers' government and socialism. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I think some of those points were actually very important. And while obviously there is a great deal of similarity between the experiences of Australia Post workers and those of Coles warehouse workers and other warehouse workers, our next speaker, who is Sue Phillips, will actually outline the experiences of teachers, of educators who themselves are going through a similar experience. And Sue is a national committee member of the SEP, and she's also the convener of the Committee to Defend Public Education. Sue's been a teacher for now almost 3 decades. She's fought against the degradation of public education, against its gutting, and because of this, she has had to fight against the role of the teacher unions. Sue is very well known, certainly in Australia, but also internationally, for her stand, for her leadership in this area, and for the organising many areas of support amongst teachers for the the struggle of the Virginia teachers, of the Chicago teachers just recently. So I'm very pleased to introduce Sue Phillips and ask you to welcome her.
On behalf of the Committee for Public Education, I'm extremely pleased to have been invited to speak at this afternoon's meeting. Throughout the 3 months lockout of Coles warehouse workers, the Committee for Public Education has fought to bring the struggle at Smeaton Grange to the attention of educators in Australia and internationally. We have carried forward this in opposition to the blackout by the media and against the isolation imposed by the Unite Workers Union and the ACTU. And I might add all the teachers' unions who never spoke a word about this struggle. In the Socialist Equality Party's statement announcing today's meeting, it makes clear that while the union has been successful at this point in imposing the dictates of Coles through literally starving workers back to work, the struggle is not over. Lessons need to be drawn by the wider sections of the working class. The destruction of jobs and conditions, the restructuring operation of Coles is not confined to warehouse workers, but is being carried out by business and governments against the working class everywhere. Nowhere is this same restructuring more evident than in the education sector. While warehouse workers work in a completely different environment to schools or universities, there is a definite commonality to the situation we all face. Increasing and untenable productivity or workload demands, working conditions imposed where we have absolutely no say in them, where our rights are suppressed, and unions that work hand in hand with the employees to impose ever impossible demands. The pandemic has only accelerated processes which were already underway. At the centre of the criminal program of herd immunity, which demands the economy and profit is prioritised over lives, has been the unrelenting campaign to open schools so that workers can be forced back into the factories and workplaces. The unions have acted as messengers and enforcers of this government and business agenda. In opposition to this program, educators in the United States, in the UK and Germany have established independent rank and file committees in the schools. Rank and file committees have been carried forward in the auto plants, among bus drivers and other sections of industries to protect their lives and that of their families. Not wasting the opportunity of the COVID crisis, the Morrison government and state Labor and Liberal governments have used the pandemic to restructure class relations and working conditions in the factories, schools and universities. Over the last year, 90,000 jobs have been destroyed at the universities by government funding cuts and corporate restructuring involving a stepped up program of commercialisation and the slashing of faculties such as humanities and arts education. At every turn, it has been agreed to by the NTEU, the academics union, who have suppressed resistance to the offensive and appealed to the universities to sit down and negotiate alternative cuts. Throughout the Coles dispute, the Socialist Equality Party, the Committee for Public Education, and the International Youth and Students for Social Equality have fought to highlight and broaden the struggle at Smeaton Grange by distributing articles through social media and right throughout the working class. Educators and students saluted the determined struggle of Coles workers and warned them about the role of the unions, experience fresh in the minds of university workers after the betrayals of the NTEU. The restructuring of education has been underway now for several decades, leading to Australia being one of the most unequal education systems in the world. In the last 6 months, 3 reports have been published exposing this vast educational inequality. It's not possible to go into these reports here, but just to cite briefly some figures. The decade between 2009 and 2018, beginning under the Labor governments of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, with the introduction of NAPLAN, saw an increase of total income for private and Catholic schools 9 to 10 times higher than for public schools. Income for private schools increased by 16.9% per student, 19.7% in Catholic schools, but only 2.1% in public schools. This is under conditions where public schools in 2018 enrolled 82% of all low socioeconomic students, 84% of Indigenous students, 77% of high disability students, and 82% of remote area students. On average, the state government's funding for public schools was cut by $330 per student per year, having the greatest impact on remote and rural schools. This has led to a catastrophe in public schools, where schools in growing numbers lack the most basic resources, including teaching staff. At the beginning of this year in New South Wales, 1,250 permanent teaching jobs remain unfilled, with some rural schools unable to function. Teachers are leaving the profession in droves due to both economic insecurity for younger teachers, but ever-increasing workload. This systematic assault on public education is most starkly seen in the imposition of a super school by the Andrews Labor government in the regional city of Shepparton in Victoria. Similar processes are underway in other states. The plan announced in 2017, dressed up as being, quote, innovative and revolutionary, end of quote, and supposedly as a result of poor NAPLAN results, is to amalgamate 4 schools into one super school with up to 2,700 students. The plan was rammed through a sham community consultation process and driven on by a hand-picked advisory committee made up of some principals, Shepparton business representatives, employment agencies, and the Australian Education Union. The AU has been complicit in the entire process. Now, this has nothing to do with education or the welfare of the children, but budget cutting and the implementation of a data-driven business agenda. The government ignored the warnings of the community opposition, including teachers, about the outcome of this move. Wellbeing and student engagement programs have been eliminated. Teachers and students have been uprooted, shifted, and divided from campus to campus, breaking up long-established relationships, leading to growing tensions and student brawls. A business curriculum is being imposed with kids channeled into specific programs. More than 50 teachers have resigned, many experienced teachers, many others have gone out on stress leave. Throughout, teachers have been gagged and threatened from speaking out. At the end of last year, when 50 teachers threatened to take strike action in opposition to the toxic culture imposed on them, the union refused to support their action. Public schools are increasingly not institutions of learning and education, but holding pens, where young people aren't taught the joy of learning or encouraged to excel academically, be creative and critical thinkers, but to obey orders and be work ready in low-paid casual gig economy jobs. The dire conditions facing young people is highlighted by the 23% increase in recruitment into the armed forces in Australia in the last year. What does it say of a system which offers its young only military service and war, but under conditions of mass unemployment, it appears as the only prospect of a permanent job? To halt the assault on public education, the Shepparton amalgamation and similar mergers, a political struggle must be developed against the federal and state governments, Labor and Liberal alike, and the corporate elite. Parents, teachers and students in Shepparton and in other schools need to take matters into their own hands. Form rank and file committees completely independent of the AEU and the teacher unions and all official political parties. Those communities then need to join up with other schools and educators facing closure and amalgamation and the assault on education across the country. A new perspective is required that rejects the domination of the capitalist market over education and all parts of working class life and defends the right of all to a high quality public education system. Thank you.
Thanks, Sue. I think that was actually quite important, and I'm sure a revelation for many workers who are not familiar with the conditions that now exist in the schools and also in the universities. There is a transformation which is taking place. Our final speaker today, however, is Oscar Grenfell, and Oscar needs no introduction, but I'm going to do one anyway. He's a member of the National Committee of the SEP, and he's a writer for the World Socialist website. He writes extensively on the struggle of workers in this country and also the political events which are taking place. He's the convener of the International Youth and Students for Social Equality, the IYSSE, and he has written a number of the articles and statements on the struggle of the Coles workers. So please welcome Oscar.
Thank you, Cheryl. Now, in calling this meeting, we described the Coles Smeaton Grange dispute as a significant turning point in the class struggle in Australia. Clearly, the lockout at Smeaton and the union sellout that ended it has enormous consequences for the 350 workers at the facility who only resumed their regular shifts last Monday. After more than 3 months locked out without a wage from the company or strike pay from the union, they've lost tens of thousands of dollars. Some have been forced to deplete all of their savings and their superannuation just to survive. And now on top of that, they're being subjected to a return to work on company terms. Straight after walking back in, workers were handed a letter from management accusing some of them of inappropriate and even unlawful behaviour for having attended a picket and taken part in protests to defend their rights. Victimisations, in other words, are clearly on the agenda. And hanging over everything is the fact that the enterprise agreement pushed through by the United Workers Union, the UWU, gives Coles everything that it wants. That is the closure of Smeaton, the destruction of all of the jobs there, and the miserly wage and redundancy provisions put forward by the company very early in the dispute. The union and management have both admitted that many of the workers will never find another full-time permanent job. That is, they face the imminent prospect of being thrown on the scrap heap. And the writing is also on the wall for thousands of other warehouse workers. First of all, the 1,800 or so workers at 4 other Coles warehouses, Eastern Creek in Sydney, the Goulburn plant, and 2 facilities in Brisbane, which are also slated to be shut by 2023, and also some 1,300 Woolworths workers who face the same prospect of being sacked as that company carries out its own restructure, almost identical to Coles and aimed at replacing 3 warehouses with 2 automated plants. As we wrote on the World Socialist website, quote, "The forced return to work on management terms is undoubtedly a blow, but the struggle is far from over. The sellout only brings to an end the first stage of the fight at Smeaton Grange, and more broadly, against a sweeping restructure being carried out by Coles, Woolworths, and throughout warehousing." And we noted there's no question that this offensive will encounter further opposition from workers. The determination to fight that was demonstrated by the Smeaton Grange workers will be replicated elsewhere, including at the other Coles and Woolworths sheds that are slated for closure. That's inevitable. But the next stage of this struggle can only be prepared and developed by learning the lessons of what took place at Smeaton Grange and the broader experiences of the working class. Critical questions must be discussed and answered. Among them, what was the significance of the struggle that the Smeaton Grange workers did carry out, and the fact that they held out for so long, some 14 weeks? What were the political forces that they came up against, and why were they defeated? And based on the logic of the dispute itself and its development, what were the tasks that were posed before the workers, as well as all other Coles and Woolworths staff? In other words, what was the alternative perspective that could have prevented defeat? As other speakers have raised, a crucial point is that we're not discussing issues that are unique to one warehouse, one company, or even in an entire industry. The Smeaton Grange dispute has been a concentrated expression of the class struggle as it's developing throughout Australia and all over the world. Comrade Sherrill reviewed the criminal response of capitalist governments everywhere to the pandemic. They've resisted and in most cases outright rejected lockdowns and other necessary measures to contain the coronavirus because of the impact that such policies would have on the activities of the major corporations. This has led to mass infections and death the world over. Hand in hand with their homicidal policy on the health front, the ruling elites are using the pandemic to accelerate an onslaught against the social and economic position of the working class. While millions have been thrown out of work internationally or hit with reduced hours and declining wages, governments have pumped trillions of dollars into the financial markets to prop up a speculative bubble and to boost the fortunes of the ultra-wealthy. The consequences of this are perhaps best summed up in an Oxfam report from January, which was entitled "The Virus of Inequality." It found that between March 21st and December 31st last year, the wealth of the world's billionaires increased by 3.9 trillion. Over the same period, workers' earnings internationally fell by almost the same amount, 3.7 trillion. I think this shows that we're living through a really unprecedented transfer of wealth from the vast mass of the population to a tiny financial elite, on top of decades of growing social inequality. In Australia, the centrepiece of this agenda is an overhaul of workplace relations and labour conditions. When the pandemic began, the unions headed by the ACTU agreed to suspend basic conditions, including set hours and overtime payments for millions of workers. This was coupled with support for programs such as JobKeeper, which amounted to massive cash handouts to the largest corporations. The drive now is for the workplace changes that were introduced on the pretext of the pandemic to be made permanent. And key to this is a stepped up assault on full-time permanent jobs. Over the past year, thousands of positions have been destroyed at Qantas, as many as 90,000 jobs have been eliminated at the universities. 1,400 sackings were recently announced at Telstra, bringing the total to 8,000 over the past 3 years, and the list could really go on. The aim of this is to bring the conditions of low-paid, precarious work in the gig economy to every section of the working class. It's no accident that Coles is at the forefront of this offensive. The company is one of the largest in Australia, with a market capitalisation of $24 billion. Its top shareholders include BlackRock and Vanguard Group, two of the biggest US investment firms, and its senior managers have extensive connections throughout the corporate and political establishment. In other words, Coles restructure, involving a drive to save $1 billion in costs by 2022, above all through the destruction of jobs, is being driven by the financial elite. For several years, our party has been charting a re-emergence of working class struggle, triggered by massive inequality, the austerity offensive of governments and the corporations, and the global crisis of capitalism, expressed most sharply in the recent period by the pandemic. We've explained that the objective logic of this process is for workers to come into conflict with all of the structures that have been used to suppress the class struggle for the past 40 years, and chief among them, the trade unions. And that's perhaps what's most significant about the Smeaton Grange struggle. As the dispute progressed, the class lines became ever clearer. On the one hand, the company and the union, and on the other side, the workers. From mid-January up to the return to work, what was developing was a rebellion of workers against the United Workers' Union. At times, the sentiment that the union was corrupt, that it was in bed with management, and that it was trying to push through a sellout was almost universal among rank and file workers. Now, we've reviewed on a number of occasions the details of the disputes. I would just be brief. The UWU and its predecessors said nothing about Coles restructure from the time that it was first announced in 2018 until mid last year. The union accepted, without any discussion among workers, that Smeaton Grange and the 4 other warehouses would be closed and all of the jobs destroyed. When negotiations for a new enterprise agreement at Smeaton began last year, the UWU said that the only issue was to ensure supposed fair redundancies and a just transition. To let off steam, the union called a one-day strike last October. Coles had already prepared for the lockout by moving production elsewhere, and it had warned that it would impose a lockout if there was any industrial action, and that's precisely what took place. Now, what was the role of the UWU throughout the lockout, which ended up spanning 14 weeks? Firstly, the union completely isolated the workers and ensured that production continued unhindered at every other Coles warehouse. Many Coles warehouse workers in Brisbane and Melbourne, in fact, only found out about the lockout months in when we campaigned outside their facilities. And the union refused to provide strike pay, even though it had declared assets of more than $300 million last June. This was a clear bid to starve the workers out. The UWU officials held continuous backroom discussions with management and organised one vote after another on an enterprise agreement offer that contained no concessions and that workers just kept on rejecting. Finally, after as many as 10 ballots, with some of the workers on the brink of pauperism, facing the prospect of months more being locked out without pay, the UWU was able to push through a sellout agreement in a ballot on February the 27th. Throughout the dispute, the Socialist Equality Party insisted that workers could only fight for their rights and prevent a sellout by breaking completely with the union. We called for the formation of independent rank and file committees to link up the workers at Smeaton Grange with their colleagues throughout Coles, Woolworths, and more broadly in the working class. We raised that such committees could organise coordinated industrial action across multiple plants, and we explained that they would be faced with major political issues, including the need for a struggle not only against the company, the government, Labor, the unions, the industrial laws, and capitalism itself. The UWU, for obvious reasons, is bitterly opposed to this perspective. But such was the hostility to the union among workers that UWU officials did not dare show their face at the picket line. In this situation, they required the assistance of other political forces. And that's where Solidarity, a pseudo-left organisation, stepped in. Like the pseudo-left as a whole, Solidarity represents an affluent layer of the upper middle class, which broke from socialism and the interests of the working class decades and decades ago. Solidarity is heavily integrated into the union bureaucracy itself, especially in the maritime and education sectors. Now, for weeks after the lockout began, Solidarity simply promoted the talking points of the UWU leaders. But as hostility among workers to the union grew, Solidarity began to put forward mild criticisms of the UWU officials. The aim of these criticisms was not to break workers from the union or to help establish genuine rank and file committees, but to prevent such a development, which we were fighting for. Solidarity's line is clearly summed up in a post-mortem of the dispute that they published last week. It's worth examining because it helps clarify the perspective that we are advancing in opposition to the unions and their pseudo-left defenders. Solidarity's article began by claiming that workers and the union had won concessions each time that the agreement was voted down, but it was unable to provide any examples because this was a lie. In fact, there were no concessions. The article then moved on to an analysis of why the UWU, which Solidarity has claimed has a well-deserved reputation for militancy, dropped the ball at Smeaton Grange. And the explanation provided by Solidarity is really no explanation at all. The UWU officials, it claimed, didn't take the lockout seriously enough and they failed to back Smeaton. Solidarity has in the past said that the sordid manoeuvres of the union are a tragedy, as though what we're dealing with is a misunderstanding or a psychological weakness of the UWU officials. What's the political purpose of this assessment? It's to insist that there's nothing fundamental in the nature of the UWU or the unions that led to the betrayal at Smeaton Grange, and to insist that workers remain trapped within this organisation. Solidarity reports, and I'll just quote, following the dispute, the workers of Smeaton feel intense feelings of betrayal, disgust and dismay at the union, as one worker put it. Some workers have even suggested leaving the union, end quote. Now this Solidarity claims that would be a huge mistake. They state, to quote again, leaving the union will only weaken workers' organisation at the workplace, making it harder to organise against victimisation and management attacks on the workforce when everyone goes back. In opposition to any sort of break with the union, Solidarity states, again to quote, the solution is to build independent rank and file organisation within the union that can work with the officials when they do the right thing and pressure them or act independently when necessary, end quote. So according to Solidarity, the union leaders will generally do the right thing by their members. But if they don't, all that's required is a little bit of a push by the rank and file and the officials will respond. But how did this actually play out at Smeaton Grange? In fact, the more opposition emerged from workers, the closer the union collaborated with management. Each time the workers voted down the sellout, the UWU officials and the company ramped up the pressure on them to capitulate. By the end of the dispute, the union was more or less openly telling workers that their options were to starve on the picket line without any assistance from the UWU or to accept the demands of Coles, that is, to accept the union betrayal. And what of Solidarity's perspective for rank and file committees within the union? Well, Solidarity did in fact create such an organisation, the Concerned Workers of Smeaton Grange, with a handful of delegates at the site. But far from fighting within the union for a change of policy, the Concerned Workers group acted as the ground force of the UWU officials. It told workers to keep their mouths shut when they publicly voiced criticism of the union. It presided over meetings where the sordid manoeuvres of the UWU officials were justified, and it accepted the return to work. In other words, Solidarity's so-called rank and file committee had a very friendly relationship with the UWU leaders as they were selling out the Smeaton Grange workers. But this group was intensely hostile to the WSWS and the SEP, telling our campaigners to leave the picket, instructing workers not to speak to us, and even threatening to call the police against us. The line of Solidarity and the pseudo-left is directed against the scientific Marxist assessment of the trade unions made by the SEP. We explain that the endless betrayals of the unions are not a mistake or solely the result of bad individual leaders. Rather, They're an expression of the transformation of the unions into completely corporatised entities, which are no longer workers' organisations in any sense of the term. The unions have always defended the profit system, but in an earlier period, when capitalism was regulated within the framework of the nation state, they performed this function by placing pressure on the employers and governments to grant limited social concessions to the working class. The globalisation of production, beginning in the 1980s, destroyed the objective basis for this national reformist program. The unions took their pro-capitalist and nationalist program to its logical conclusion, and they've become the chief proponents of ensuring the international competitiveness of their own national industries by imposing continuous cuts to wages, conditions, and jobs. This has been accompanied by the ever greater enrichment of the union officials, many of whom earn six-figure salaries, sit on the board of multi-million-dollar superannuation funds, and receive funds directly from the companies that they claim to be in struggle against. This is a universal phenomenon that can be charted in every country. In Australia, it was the Hawke and Keating Labor governments and the unions that imposed the vast economic restructuring that began in the 1980s. This involved smashing up militant workers' organisations, deregulating the economy, and destroying hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs. In fact, many of the anti-strike provisions that exist today date from the accords between the Labor government and the unions in the 80s. In the 1990s, it was Keating's Labor government and the unions that brought in enterprise bargaining, dividing employees up workplace by workplace so that continuous cuts to conditions and wages could be imposed. And of course, in 2009, the Labor government of Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard imposed Fair Work Australia, the punitive industrial legislation that bans virtually all collective action by workers. The consequences of this regime, enforced by Labor and the unions, are clear from this graph, showing a massive decline in strike activity since the early 1980s. This demonstrates in black and white that if there is going to be any struggle by workers, it requires a rebellion against the unions and the entire apparatus of suppression that they've enforced for the past 40 years. When we call for independent rank and file committees, we're raising the need for workers to begin developing their own organisations they control and lead, completely independent of the unions. Their role is not to pressure the unions or to write letters of protest to the Labor Party and local MPs. What they would do is ensure workers were fully aware of the events in their workplace and more broadly by distributing information. They would provide a forum for democratic discussion and debate among workers, and they'd serve as a vehicle to plan concrete actions, including unified industrial and political action across industries and involving broader sections of workers. When workers do enter into struggle, as at Smeaton Grange, they're not just up against one company management. They're posed with a fight against the entire political establishment, the trade union apparatus, and the capitalist state itself. This lineup can only be defeated by a mass political movement of the working class. The issue of socialism is directly posed. The program of the capitalist class is austerity, mass unemployment, and poverty for the working class, and unlimited wealth for the billionaires. This program means dictatorship and war. The alternative is the fight to unify the international working class in the struggle for world socialism. This involves the fight to establish workers' governments that would place the banks and the corporations under public ownership and democratic workers' control. Production must be organised to meet the needs of workers and society at large, not the profit interests of a tiny corporate elite. That's the perspective that we're advancing and that must guide the emerging struggles of workers everywhere. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Oscar. Look, there's been a lot of issues that have been canvassed by John, Sue and Oscar, and we very much would like questions to be posted. You need to post them in the chat. I will remind everybody to post to everyone, not just to the panelists. I notice that there's numbers of chats that are just going to the panelist. But we've got questions starting to come in, and there's one question: have workers of Smeaton Grange left the UWU due to the betrayal of the UWU? If there's any others, please start to develop them and compile them. While you're doing that, what I'd like to raise at this point is an appeal for our regular monthly fund. I mean, one of the issues that we have been discussing and highlighting is the role of the media, the complete complicity by the media in the veil of silence which has been carried out over the struggle of the Smeaton Grange workers, and really every other fight that is undertaken. I mean, no one would know that this is that there is what is taking place at the moment. Community action in Shepparton, there was in Griffith, in Murwillumbah, against these super schools. Nobody knows. It's virtually, there may be an article in one of the papers or one of the websites, it then disappears. And it has only been really through the World Socialist website, and also the fight to take our analysis to broad sections of workers, to go to factories, to speak to other workers, and to inform them of the developments which are taking place both here and also internationally. And it's that sort of work that we have to both enhance and expand. We have relaunched the World Socialist website in October of last year. That has enabled a far broader access and accessibility of our analysis, the history of the Fourth International, to broader sections of people. We have to develop more writers. We have to ensure that the analysis is made available, both on social media and also to factories, schools, workplaces, and elsewhere. There is a great deal of work which has to be done, and we need the resources, we need the finances to do that. I mean, one of the characteristics of the role of the media and really of other political parties is that people, ordinary people, are just not told the truth about the situation. That's what we do. Whether it is agreed to, whether in that sense people want to hear it. We have an obligation, a responsibility to ensure that broad sections of people, of workers, know what the reality is that they face. And that is a situation which we have to develop. And so I would very much appeal to your generosity to donate as generously, as much as you possibly can. If you're in Australia, please donate to sep.org.au/website/donate. If you're outside Australia, because we are not allowed to accept financial contributions from outside the country, then please donate to wsws.org/donate. So I would very much appeal to you on that. Now we have the question about the UWU. I'm not sure whether there's any other questions. I mean, maybe while again people are thinking about their questions, if you want to answer that, Oscar, and I think Sue wants to make a comment as well about it.
Yep. So, I mean, as to whether workers at Smeaton Grange are leaving the union in response to the betrayal that's just being carried out, I think clearly that's being discussed. I mean, that's what Solidarity is warning about. There's a whole discussion underway among work, at Smeaton, but also other Coles facilities about the nature of the United Workers Union. I mean, it's a very stark experience that workers have gone through. They've paid dues to the UWU for months and months, in some cases, years, including to the predecessors of the UWU. And workers have said, the officials, the delegates, the officials are scrupulous in collecting our union dues, but then when we're locked out, we get nothing. The union officials are collaborating with management against us. They're trying to force us to accept an agreement that we are hostile to. And the issue of strike pay is just completely off the table. I think as we noted, the UWU in its report for the last financial year declared assets of over $300 million, which included more than 94 million in cash holding. I mean, this is a very large organisation with substantial resources. None of that was going to go to the workers who were being starved out on the picket line. So clearly, this has had an impact. I think just the point I would raise is that there's the question of individual workers leaving the union. But I think in and of itself, I mean, that is not a solution. It reflects growing anger, opposition. But the real next step that is required is to begin forming independent organisations in opposition to the UWU and all of the other unions. I think that's one of the critical lessons of Smeaton Grange. In the absence of rank and file committees, independent organisation, opposition can be suppressed, dissipated, workers can be worn out. And there's really no forum without such organisations where you can have even a democratic discussion among rank and file workers. So the formation of rank and file committees its necessity is posed by the situation itself. And clearly, within such committees, there's the need for a discussion of political perspective and program. I mean, we're raising that what Coles is carrying out, what Woolworths is carrying out, raises very directly the need for a fight to transform these companies into publicly owned utilities that are democratically controlled by the workers themselves. But that raises the issue of the fight for a workers' government and for socialism. I'll just make those points.
Yeah, just to add to what Oscar has raised, I mean, and I notice in the chat, Mike Head has put in that, over the last 4 decades, you've had a decline in union membership. And that's absolutely true. I think that in private industry, I might be wrong here, but in private industry, union membership has dropped to as low as 15%. In the public sector unions, it's a little higher. And one of our members of the CFPE in South Australia informed me last week about how union membership is now in massive decline amongst teachers in South Australia. And this is in 2019, an EBA which didn't address any of the conditions of teachers in South Australia, workload, class size, specialist teachers and so on, was rammed through by the union bureaucracy. I think, that, and they said very similar things to what was said at Smeaton Grange, that is, look, guys, we're all democratic here, and you can decide whether you think this is a good deal or not. We're not going to, impose anything on you and so on. They did that in South Australia, and they rammed through a vote, giving only people you know, something like 48 hours or less to read the agreement and so on. That EBA vote was just passed. I remember the vote was something like 49% no and 51% yes. And since then, and teachers were extraordinarily disappointed. Many of them didn't even believe the vote was true. And those that voted yes had a sort of sense, well, if we vote no, then, you know, and left in the hands of the union, we're, you know, nothing is going to come out in our favour anyway. Since then, membership has declined in South Australia as a result of that betrayal, and down to less than 50%. And that's extraordinarily low for teachers. But as Oscar has underlined in the last part of his contribution, it's one thing to leave the union, and teachers are. You see it on the various union Facebook pages. I've had a gutful of this, I've had enough, you know, we're sold down the river and so on, and they resign from the union. But just resigning in itself does not resolve the issue. And it requires a higher sort of level of political consciousness to understand, you know, what is the history of the unions, the role that they play, and the need for the working class to develop their own organisations of struggle. And of course, that's why we're fighting for the establishment of these rank and file committees. I think the graph that that was a part of Oscar's contribution shows how, you know, since various agreements have been signed off by the unions, anti-strike legislation and so on, activity, you know, has gone to an all-time low. But I think, you know, it's you know, it's what's most important is that, you know, when teachers or any section of the working class break out of the unions, that they understand that that's the first stage, and it can't be left at the level of anger or frustration by the situation, but that means developing new organisations of struggle, and that requires, you know, a higher level of political understanding, which is what we're fighting. The SCP, the CFPE, the IYSSE is fighting to bring in.
Thanks, Sue. John, I think, wants to make some points too.
Yeah, I think what Sue has just raised, I think is really important. The only thing I'd add to it is experiences from Australia Post, and yeah, you know, because I don't know how many workers, you know, at Smeaton Grange left the union. But there's you know, not only no confidence. You would go in the workplace, and there'd be, you know, one, you know, there's a certain layer of workers around the union, and they would say, well, you do this, and, you know, you should be part of the union. And they just openly and loudly say, look, the union is just completely useless. And that there's a certain anger and all that. And then there's a sort of then the sort of other thing that comes up is, as well, you know, since they've been restructured, we should go join another union, maybe the Transport Workers Union. They'll be better or something like that. You know, I think that the fundamental problem for, you know, not just in Smeaton Grange, Australia Post or anywhere else, the fundamental problem is, you know, them really thinking through and cognizing and reading the analysis of the World Socialist website and about the transformed nature of the unions, you know, and breaking with these sort of hazy conceptions about unions as they were in the 70s or the 80s, or, you know, these big mass struggles, and, you know, that these unions had they represent the interests of the working class. I think to a certain degree, it's, you know, by reading the articles of the World Socialist website and our analysis, it's sort of working through theoretically, you know, the transformation of the unions and why that's actually happened. And that it's not a product of, you know, useless individuals or corrupt individuals. It's, as, you know, the last point I'd make is, you know, is, as we point out, it's in the transformation of the nature of capitalism. Capitalism has become global, international, you know, nationally based organisations like the unions, can't, fight them. You need a new strategy. That the strategy of the rank and file committees, and also as you read through the World Socialist website, it's not just we're advocating this in Australia. We're advocating this, on an international basis in every country that the International Committee operates from. That's the strategy that the working class has to really take up and theoretically work through to understand it. I just leave it at that.
I think it's very instructive to remember the situation which has developed just recently in the United States. There's a ballot taking place in Amazon in Alabama at the moment, and which I think it concludes towards the end of March. And that ballot is whether the union is introduced, whether it's accepted into the Amazon warehouse in that state. And most extraordinarily, Joe Biden, the new president of the United States, felt the need to intervene into this discussion and this ballot to urge workers to vote for the union. Now, this has never happened, never in the history of the United States has the President of the United States intervened into such an event. And what was clear from his intervention is that he understood, and they all understand, that the union, far from developing decent working conditions, pay rates, or anything else, certainly in Amazon, which is now notorious for its brutal work methods, the level of infections and deaths in the Amazon warehouses is really very high. And there was actually an article that I read the other day in which the conditions now confronting delivery drivers in Amazon, and this is an area which Amazon is now moving increasingly into, which of course is some of the driving factors behind Australia Post's cost-cutting drive to exploitation, increasing the workload of Australia Post workers, is because they're now in a competitive situation with Amazon. But these workers, these delivery workers in Amazon, were reporting that they're working 14-hour shifts and cannot take a toilet break. And so they're now forced to urinate in plastic bottles, because if their van stops for more than 3 minutes, then they get a call from the phone centre asking whether they've broken down, what is going on, why they're not delivering. I mean, the level of exploitation in this facility, and of course, Bezos has not become the second wealthiest man in the world, and for a whole period the wealthiest, without the most brutal forms of exploitation. But Biden understood that in order to prevent any sort of independent struggle of Amazon workers, and therefore risking other sections of workers, that the union was required to ensure that they could carry through the suppression of these workers. So if there's any unclarity about the understanding that the ruling class itself, including, its governments in the union and the role of the union, then that should dispel it. It really is a very unprecedented situation. But we do have other questions. Hang on. One from from Phil. What role do petty bourgeois woke community advocates have to offer the international industrial working class that we and Marxists can't do? And then there's another question. Well, actually, we can deal with that question because the others pertain somewhat more to specifically Smeaton Grange. So woke community is the identity politics community. Is there any, Oscar, did you want to deal with that one, or who wants to take that one up?
I can make a couple of initial points. I think the question is referring to identity politics. As we've raised, this has nothing to offer the working class. In fact, it's been promoted for the past 40 or more years to divide workers along racial lines, along the lines of gender and sexuality, and really to suppress any discussion of the fundamental division in the world, which is class. It's striking. The more social inequality has grown, which it has exponentially over the past 4 decades, the more aggressively the ruling elite, the corporate media, and a definite upper middle class constituency claims that the decisive issue in society is race, gender, whatever else. I mean, this plays a very definite function. And I think, you know, we were discussing before the role of the pseudo-left organisations that broke with socialism, Marxism, the working class a long time ago. They're heavily based on identity politics. This is what they promote, and it's completely bankrupt. I mean, it has nothing in common with Marxism. In fact, it's directed against the fight by socialists, which is to unite the working class on a class basis. I mean, we say that the fundamental issue in society is not race, gender, sexual orientation, it's your class position. And that's the basis historically of progressive revolutionary and socialist politics, where the only tendency that has such a clear opposition to identity politics that explains its function, which I think is really critical, including on the campuses among young people where these nostrums are so heavily promoted.
Yeah, just on this issue of identity politics and in relationship to what's happening in education and the situation in Shepparton. I mean, there has been community opposition, teacher opposition to this super school for several years now. The Shepparton community is made up of refugees, lots of refugees from the Middle East. It has a large Aboriginal population. All sections of the working class are really represented. And for many, many years, there has been no difficulties or problems of, what is now being characterised as systemic racism. What has 2 weeks ago, the ABC ran an article based on a leaked report, supposedly from a independent multicultural advisor, saying that there was systemic racism in the community. And this was being carried out by teachers at the school. They found a number of incidents by teachers. Students were being racialised within the classroom. A whole series of allegations were being said. And this ABC report followed a whole number of violent student brawls that had emerged in one of the schools in Shepparton in the last few weeks. The accusations against teachers and so on are fairly extraordinary. This report was given to, it took 6 months during 2020, and it was given to the Department of Education at the end of November. Serious allegations were being made. and nothing was said. And if this was the case, if there's all these teachers in there that are racist and so on, how come the government, the department, didn't send in resources, multicultural aids, programs, and so on? They didn't. And it only emerges after this situation amongst students. Now, what is becoming clear is that this really has been somewhat of a diversion. The following day, there was an interview on the ABC with a young Aboriginal student there, reiterating some of these allegations, holding a Black Lives Matter sign. Last week, a meeting was held of Aboriginal people, Kooris, and only Kooris were allowed to attend the meeting. You couldn't attend if you were white. And what is taking place, and this is really the whole purpose of identity politics, is to really split and divide the community. To say, well, the problem, problem is racism, and that's the problem at the school. But in fact, none of these issues were, or if they did exist, were very rare in the past. And it's being used to really blame the victims of this whole process that is being carried out by the government, to blame the teachers, to blame the kids for a model that is proven to be absolutely disastrous and is against the interests of the working class as a whole. So I think, trying to give a sort of concrete example of how this is used to whip up division and divert attention away from the real problem, which is in Shepparton, is this model, but overall is capitalism.
Now we'll go on to some of the other questions. How can rank and file committees prevent pseudo-left groups from infiltrating them as they have solidarity with Smeaton Grange unions? There's another question from Steve. Coles operation manager Swindles said that Coles had told workers of Coles's plans. Is that true? And then he's asked another question. Coles intends to close Eastern Creek. Has there been a response by workers there?
It depends when the question's referring to. Certainly prior to the imposition of the lockout in October, management had said publicly that there was any industrial action by the union. They just shut the facility over the Christmas period. The UWU went around and told workers that this would never happen because Christmas is a busy period, and they called a 24-hour strike to let off steam. As we discussed, the company responded by doing what it said it would, which was lock them all out. Since the dispute began, there's been interesting information from workers both at Smeaton Grange and elsewhere raising that weeks before the lockout was imposed, you had product lines being moved out of Smeaton Grange, moved into other warehouses. You had pop-up sheds which had been established to cope with panic buying, taking on more work. It would have been very clear to the union officials, in my view, that a lockout was being prepared, or that at least the company was making contingencies to impose that. As we know, they did nothing to prevent that from occurring, and when it did, they basically hung the workers out to dry.
And there's the question in regards to the rank and file committees. I think Sue or John can deal with that, but look, the rank and file committees should be open to workers who do not want, who agree that the committees are independent of the unions and are not going to conduct themselves as a pressure group. I mean, workers don't have to be socialist. If these pseudo-left groups try, you know, and to become members, well, that will depend on the role that they play. You know, we are entirely capable, and workers are entirely capable of dealing politically to clarify the role that these organisations play. And certainly the experiences that have been undertaken internationally with the rank and file committees is that certain workers, you know, come to it. We will fight. Our party fights in these committees for a socialist perspective. We fight for a political program and a political perspective. That doesn't have to be agreed to in order for workers to be part of a rank and file committee. They don't actually have to agree with our perspective, but that's what we fight for. And the issue is bound up with what role these committees will play. Under a different perspective, they will play a very different role. And so there's a lot of certainly discussion. There's some workers decide that they don't agree with it and they go off. Others stay and fight for, you know, for the development of the committees and also their increasing connection with other sections of workers. You know, one of the aspects of a rank and file committee is that unlike what takes place with the unions, rank and file committees will turn out to other sections of workers, you know, fight to have rank and file committees established in, if we're talking about schools, in multiple schools, that they then talk to each other, they communicate with each other, they find out what's happening in their different communities and different schools. They're not separated and isolated from each other, because that's what happens. That's what happens now. I mean, when we went to the Eastern Creek warehouse at the outset of the Smeaton Grange struggle, many of the Eastern Creek workers didn't know that this had in fact taken place. I mean, this is literally a few, you know, kilometres apart. And Melbourne workers didn't know, Brisbane workers didn't know, Goulburn workers didn't know that this had taken place. Now that's not an accident. What the rank and file committees would do is provide information, provide an accurate and truthful assessment of what is taking place, not just in their own plant or in their own school or university, but, you know, more broadly. And of course, if one remembers, the access to information, to truthful information, is in fact a revolutionary question. Why else would Julian Assange be rotting in Belmarsh prison to this day for making information accessible to broad sections of people? Our own website has been subject to censorship, to attempts to ensure that people can't find us, in order to block ordinary people from having access to truthful and accurate information. So part of the role of the rank and file committees is to allow workers to talk to each other, to allow contact and communication, also not just within the same industry. I mean, there's now going to be, with the end of JobKeeper and the cutting back of JobSeeker, there is no question there will be an increase in unemployment, plus also evictions. You know, communities will need to set up rank and file committees, community committees, whatever they wanted to call it, so that they can communicate defend each other, organise and coordinate action and you know, mechanisms by which they can protect their jobs and communities. So there's, you know, we're not worried about different formations or different individuals joining the rank and file committee, but the issue is going to be what political perspective they adhere to.
Can I make a point on that too?
Yep.
Yep. Look, I give a bit more concrete. At Australia Post, there are people who are members of the Greens. There are people who are suspected to have been around the pseudo left and all this. I think the last point, what Cheryl had raised, is really important, because what, you know, for all their criticism, these people around the Greens and all this, and you know, and the pseudo left, they all say you still have to stay within the framework of the trade unions, and you have to accept their framework. And one of the things that are being promoted at the moment is, well, you know, the ADM is going to be soft, because Anthony Albanese has made some noises in Parliament, and the Labor Party might, you know, do some opposition to, you know, or maybe even try to get a vote against the ADM and so on. And they say you have to go within those channels, the existing channels, Parliament, you know, and all of that. And I think, you know, one of the things we need to do, and we've been doing, is to, you know, point out the history of the last 30 years of that perspective of, you know, going through these official channels. The working class has suffered defeat after defeat, but also, you know, what it does, it clearly, it's a different orientation from what Cheryl has just described. It's not about mobilizing the working class independently. It's not about, you know, going to, you know, different sections, your own workplace, you know, I mean, in terms of the industry or going to other industries. It's about, you know, putting your faith in trying to reform or pressure these organizations like the Labor Party, and that somehow, that's proven to, over decades, has proven to be a complete catastrophe for the working class, you know. And I think I agree with Cheryl, what she said, you know, raised, you know, about, you know, it's open to anyone, you know, who wants to join, but who wants to fight for a different perspective. I mean, you know, the last point I'll just make is that, you know, among people who I suspect are, you know, around the pseudo left, you know, in answering to what, you know, the SCP is putting forward, they say, look, you know, the problem is the system's damaged, meaning like the Labor Party and the trade unions, but it's not broken. And you've got to try to fix it within, and have these sort of arguments which are always aimed at channeling, you know, what, what sentiment, discontent and anger to what's being done, always trying to channel it back into, you know, into these, you know, through this unions and the Labor Party. And I think that's, and I won't repeat what points Cheryl made about the role of, you know, providing information and all that, providing information and getting workers to know more about what's happening in different places. Because this is what they've done, the unions and the Labor Party, under enterprise bargaining, is completely atomized, you know, not only from industry to industry, you know, or factory to factory, or workplace to workplace, but even within the workplaces themselves. But I'll leave it at that.
Just to answer one of Steve's questions, there's a comment in the chat saying, I work at Coles Eastern Creek, is it National Distribution Centre, and there is growing anger toward the union and their betrayal to our brothers and sisters at Smeaton Grange. He then goes on to say, we were told 2 weeks after our EBA negotiations in October 2018 of our closure, but no date was given for when that would happen. So they're actually helpful comments, I think. There's also some other points that have been made. One is, which I'll read out. It's a little bit out of order, but it pertains to the question that's already been raised. This is from Tanya. What is your position on boycotting Coles, or in the case of McCormack's, don't buy Subway? The UWU is having a field day herding opposition into community pickets. And also, just as a comment in regards to rank and file committees, this is from Jenny saying, I've been watching the discussions on Teachers Against Dying on Facebook, which is a website opposed to the reopening of schools in the United States and Britain and elsewhere, which is being demanded by the Biden and Johnson and really every government to demand that teachers undertake face-to-face teaching under conditions where the pandemic is just, it's surging through schools and through the communities. A few present their encounters with the SEP rank and file committees negatively and call the SEP a cult. I've heard this slander before. How to argue against such a position in a public forum? Okay, so there's some other questions. Sue or anybody want to deal with them?
Yeah, the Facebook page against Teachers Against Dying on Facebook. We interviewed the fellow who launched that Facebook and several months ago now, and hundreds and hundreds of educators now have died, including students. And of course, this Facebook page, has been, closely followed by teachers. Our rank and file committees, I think we've established many now. We've got educator rank and file committees in New York, Chicago, LA, Michigan, Philadelphia, Texas, and Alabama. Anyway, there are many educator rank and file committees being established. And the purpose of these committees is to, as Cheryl's gone through and so on, is to oppose, the unsafe opening of the schools, which is proceeding, and to provide teachers with scientific, genuine information about the situation, and to fight to sort of broaden these rank and file committees to other sections of workers, because as we've discussed, the opening of the schools, the purpose of the opening of the schools is to allow workers to be forced back out of their homes and back into the factories. I haven't seen this discussion taking place, but it seems to me this a cult. We're hardly a cult, we're hardly some secret organisation. We're continually fighting to broaden these rank and file committees, bring in all sorts of layers, and as others have expressed, you don't have to be a socialist to join our rank and file committees, but you do have to agree that the rank and file committees have to be developed independent of the unions. That's, if you don't agree with that, well, you can't really be a part of one of these rank and file committees. It seems to me, I don't know who's saying that we're a cult, but it seems like they obviously do not agree with the political perspectives that we're fighting for. All of our educator rank and file committee meetings are advertised on the World Socialist website. Anyone can attend. You can attend from Australia if you want to participate in these educator rank and file committees, and many of our members here have participated, myself included, in some of these meetings. But it just seems to me that this is sort of an accusation which has a sort of political perspective behind it to really, stop serious educators and students joining, and to raise a sort of question mark over what we're doing. So that's how I'd answer that.
We are now getting to the end of our meeting, and so we will have to start to wind up. I think that the question from Tanya, what is our position on boycotting Coles? And as you say, this is a field day herding opposition into community pickets. I mean, look, boycotting Coles, well, that's just a promotion of Woolworths or Aldi. I mean, these are stunts. They're designed to dissipate any sort of unified political struggle of workers. This is a very well-worn path. Certainly the Stalinists, the Communist parties were past masters at these sorts of really apolitical, individualised forms of protest. And it is all designed to ensure that workers don't actually undertake their own independent struggles. And so we oppose them. And I mean, the issue of a cult, look, we've been maligned, attacked many times before. I mean, the issue is, what is it about the rank and file committees that they see as cultish, attempting to incorporate broad sections of workers to carry through individual and independent action in their workplaces, to develop workers politically, to educate, to draw them into political struggles. That's a cult. Well, it's not usually what is a cult does, and so it really, I don't think one should be particularly perturbed by these sorts of slanders. Myself, I don't think that's what we need to concentrate on. But before we end up, I just want to quickly draw everybody's attention to, again, Mearing Books. We have our website, which is email sales@mearing.com.au, and we will be launching our own website, which will be part of the mearingbooks.com, mearing.com, website, towards the end of March. And we will certainly ensure that everybody is informed that we will have our own website where you can order books, we can send them to you, or we can deliver them to you. The books that we would like to just draw your attention to is today, What the Royal Commission into Australia's Trade Unions Revealed. I think we advertised this last time, and it is a really very, very important pamphlet. It is a 5-part series on the report of the Royal Commission into the trade unions in Australia. This was one which was initiated by Tony Abbott when he was the Prime Minister, the Liberal Prime Minister, as an attempt not so much to deal with whatever corruption certainly exists amongst the trade union bureaucracy. They know about that corruption, they accede to it. This was far more to do with an attack on the working class itself. But what it did do, that one of the byproducts of it, something of an accidental one, one suspects, is drew out what in fact some of the relations were by the trade unions with superannuation health funds, with banks, and some of the very corrupt and dubious practices which were underway and still are underway by the trade union bureaucracy. This pamphlet is $5, and as an adjunct, I think, to that is Marxism and the Trade Unions, which is a pamphlet which we have compiled from a lecture which was undertaken by Comrade David North, and which is also in the Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century, which we've also got available today. Both the pamphlets are $5 each. The Russian Revolution and the Unfinished 20th Century is $25. So I would very much urge you to purchase, to begin your Marxist library. In closing, I'd like to certainly thank you for your questions, your participation, but most importantly, I would urge you to join. If you agree with the analysis of the SEP and the International Committee, if you understand the necessity for the fight for the development of the revolutionary leadership of the working class to resolve, as Trotsky said, the crisis of revolutionary leadership which confronts mankind, then I urge you to make the decision to join the SEP. You can allocate any amount of time that you want for discussion. We are always available, but please think seriously about making this extraordinarily important, really the most important decision that you will make, and join our party and become part of the fight for the overthrow of capitalism and the development of a new period of history of mankind. But as I said, thank you for your participation, for your presence, for your questions, for your donations, and bid you good evening. And we will leave the meeting open so that you can get the website details or any other details that you want. But we'd certainly like to continue the discussion. Thank you very much.